Welcome to the Plastic Recycling Podcast. I'm your host, Al Kareem, and today we're joined by one of our most popular guests, Emily Friedman. She's a Senior Market Editor at ICIS. Welcome, Emily. Second
Happy
time
to.
we're having you on the podcast.
Yes, and I am honored to be given a second shot at this wonderful podcast.
So if you are doing anything to do with rPET, you're managing recycled content goals, trying to stay ahead of shifting policy and pricing, this episode is definitely for you. We're diving into trade dynamics, tariffs, sustainability mandates, and reshaping, and talking about how that's reshaping the way brands and recyclers operate. Emily, let's get into it. Let's start with what's changed over the last year, and maybe even more particularly over the last month, because we've seen the market shift quite a little bit. Things that procurement teams, sustainability teams kind of to ignore.
Yes, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of change in this last year. I think first and foremost, you have to say tariffs. I think that is underlying in a lot of the activity that we're seeing today, both on the supply and the demand side. So tariff uncertainty coming out of the US has really encouraged proactive purchasing, has made international trade much more uncertain, and has also given consumers cause for concern. And we've seen that appear in consumer goods purchasing data and demand. So trade first and foremost, but what we're seeing in the last month in particular, which you alluded to, is just an absolute crash across several different recycled plastic commodities, including recycled PET. Part of this was seasonally expected. We typically do see higher supply of that feedstock bottle bale material in the summer because folks are drinking more, thus they're hopefully recycling more. But that was really paired with an immediate onset of weaker demand as several recyclers noticed that they were sitting on heavier feedstock inventory. Their in-product demand for rPET was slowing down, and they decided to step away from that feedstock market. So ultimately, we've seen some really low prices over the last month in bale feedstocks, and that'll trickle down to pellet and flake in the near future.
Are you seeing this across the country in terms of on the East Coast and the West Coast on all sides?
100%, but for different reasons. The only thing that really goes across the board is the supply side. So summer's happening, whether you're in California or you're in New York. And so you will see that higher summer supply, as well as US wide consumer goods demand is a little soft, but regional dynamics are actually at play. In the West Coast, you have Mexico as a very large export demand player. They have recently backed off, I'd say, in the last month or two from that export demand. And without that demand propping up the West Coast market, that's really why we're seeing some of the softness in bale prices over there. Whereas on the East Coast, you have more bottle to bottle players, as well as you have some fiber entities. We've seen fiber really pull back in the last month or so as they're gauging their own in product demand for carpet or other fiber products. So, yes, the answer low prices across the board, but when you really dig into the why, there could be a little bit of nuances to why one region's seeing one price and the other is seeing maybe a little bit higher of a price.
Let's continue down this track a little bit in terms of why Mexico has pulled back, why the fiber plants have pulled back. Talked a little bit about possibly carpet sales, but let's dig in a little bit more into Mexico.
Yeah, so Mexico really came to the forefront of the West Coast rPET market. And late 2023, we saw record exports of PET scrap, largely bales, to Mexico in 2024, and pretty solid numbers here in 2025 thus far. But just like the US, they also see increased summer supply. And so that has been helping local dynamics, easing the urge to buy internationally to support the supply constraints locally. Also, they're seeing some of the same in product weakness. I spoke with a converter just recently of rigid plastic packaging, and they said that their sales have absolutely tanked. So much so that in some cases they're looking at potentially pausing production to avoid higher inventories or taking opportune maintenance events early, which is also something I'm seeing in the US market as well. So they're impacted by a lot of the same things that we are. And so they've just had less of a need to supplement their own local supply of rPET with US material. If you're looking at the fiber player, these tend to be very cost sensitive. players. A lot of their consumers don't really care if it has recycled content or not. They just need to deliver a high quality and low cost product. In some cases, recyclers have learned that you can have kind of a self fulfilling prophecy when it comes to bale market. The way that the system works is that a MRF or material recovery facility is going to collect recycling every week, no matter how strong or how weak the demand is. And they need to move that material because of limited on-site storage at those MRF facilities. If a recycler or multiple recyclers choose to limit purchases, MRFs are left with no choice but to continue slashing prices until they're able to move that material. I think some fiber players saw this as an opportunity, seeing the increased summer supply, thinking that bale prices could be lower later in the summer, and they took some opportunities to pump on feedstock purchase in order to get a more competitive price down the line. And it seems like it's worked.
I got it. So we have two aspects, obviously, of this, right? One is your demand side, which is very uncertain going forward because we don't know how the US economy is going to behave. We don't know how the global economy is going to behave. And on the other side, you have the supply aspect where the summer season will end and your bottle supply will start to contract a little bit more. What kind of, if you peek into your crystal ball, Emily, what kind of where do you see the market being in September, in October, and going into the winter months?
So, particularly on the East Coast, where we see PET bale prices today in the low to mid single digit, I typically hear the rhetoric from players that these levels just aren't sustainable. And so often when we hit this low of a price, there is some moderate rebound to say high single digits, low double digits in pricing. That is, I think, is maybe the most likely outcome of a late summer, early fall market. I don't anticipate that we'll stay at the prices we are seeing today because of that dialogue around the lack of stability for MRFs at these prices. But at the end of the day, as you referenced with demand, that's not going to improve. And tight beverage is one of the strongest end markets for rPET, and that is very seasonal. So by September, the season's over at that point, and you have to wait until late winter when companies start preparing and into the spring for next year's season. So demand is not really expected to be any sort of driver in this equation. It really will only be supply, which, as you referenced, won't tighten up until probably November, December.
Right. So we're looking at a soft market for the next 2, 3, 4, 5 months.
Yes, I would say so. Yeah, but pending, of course, as someone who lives here in Houston, Texas, any sort of unforeseen natural disasters, if there were to be a severe weather event that impacted virgin supply, of course, that would increase the attractiveness of locally produced rPET, and we could see market movement there. But that's a big if, and for my sake, I'm hoping is not one that will happen.
Sure. I think for all of us. So let's shift the conversation a little bit into how policy of this administration is starting to shape global supply routes, where you're starting to see longer term thinking of should people buy local? Should people start to draw up other trade routes that might be more tariff proof if something like that ever exists? What does that look like?
Yeah, early on, call it March or April, many of my market contacts were making these backup supply chain plans. So a lot of this, I think, has been mapped. And what I saw out of those activities, we had players definitely looking at domestic supply, but not so much jumping full in. So it was more, hey, let's reach out to that supplier. Let's make ourselves known once again. It's not like they set up immediate contracts, though, with the domestic supply over international. What we also saw is some discussion around inventory and warehousing capabilities of supply partners. So if you are asking your trading partner, hey, can you keep some US inventory on hand for us so that we have a runway if tariffs do happen and we have some time to figure out a backup plan? Or maybe even changing freight terms. So instead of pricing being set FOB at the international country, can we change that to a delivered price? Or can we explicitly mark out who's going to be owning some of the tariff costs if those come into play? These were a lot of the conversations that were had at the time, but ultimately the US market is exposed one way or another. Even local recyclers here in the US will import some flake feeds to supplement their pellet production. So even if a brand or converter thinks that they're well insulated by purchasing local rPET, In many ways, they're still actually exposed to the international market.
Yeah. We're obviously seeing more and more legislation come into place in different states. Do you feel that has an immediate or interim impact over the next 12 to 24 months in terms of auto bills and supply availability to be able to tackle those volume of imports?
Immediately not. What comes to mind is some of the EPR programs. For example, Oregon having started the first plastic packaging related EPR program July 1st of this year, Colorado soon on the heels. But with these programs, they're mainly in the stage of standing up the actual system, making sure the fees that are collected are accurate, and then figuring out who and how the funds should be dispersed to improve the collection system. So, true improvement to the infrastructure and to collection access will probably take several years for us to see that, which at that point we could see maybe some impact on supply to recycle plastics. I think the same can be said about the demand side of the equation from those same bills. A lot of discussion was had around eco modulation. So, where brand companies could get changes to their fees if they had plastic packaging that was either sustainable or if it had features that were not desirable, they could get additional fees. PCR was promised as a fee reduction through eco modulation, but we clearly haven't really seen that come to fruition in Oregon. It looks like Colorado, it's gonna be a little bit more explicit. Hey, if you use PCR, you will get a fee reduction. That could lead to some demand. But again, this is multiple years in the making.
So if we talk about the demand cycle overall, right, compared to virgin prices, which at lows and they continue to be depressed, what's driving the demands if the legislation is patchy and it's not really forcing companies, brands to use recycled content compared to Europe, for example, where it's very explicit? Walk us through that demand cycle and how does that shift over the next 12 to 24 months, apart from the economy?
The sad thing is what I see today in the short term now through year end is that there isn't much necessarily driving the demand, as you say. Regulation is a patchwork right now, and a lot of companies had ambitious recycle content goals, but are seem to be scaling back those goals or just scaling back to regulatory minimums. So we are in a period now because there's so much scrutiny on bottom line and cost that I have heard conversations about converters or brands seeking reductions in their PCR volumes in order to mitigate that premium cost. Very unfortunate. And I think it's short sighted in that recycled plastic isn't going away. You have building regulatory momentum in Europe, as you mentioned. So if you're an international player, it definitely is not going away. And then here in the US, the existing recycled content laws are going to continue to ramp up over time. And so would hate to see companies burn bridges just because of the current weakness in market conditions today. Or even worse, what we've seen is some recyclers closing their doors. I'm referencing Tech's recent announcement of their closure of ClearPath Recycling and Evergreen's announcement that they would be shutting down their bale to flake operations in Riverside, California. That capacity is gone. And so in the future, when we do need more because the regulation will increase, it might not be there.
It's definitely a train that's left the station, but sometimes the train slows down and sometimes it speeds up. And hopefully we can continue to have the train move and not be stagnant. Let's chat a little bit more about brands and their sustainability targets because we've seen a number of brands struggle to meet their sustainability targets. When you look at the different brands in the US, what do you see that landscape being? Because obviously they're a huge driver of demand. They set the bar. They create this infrastructure in some ways indirectly. They're the front runners. How is that looking overall?
Really still a mixed bag. When you talk about brands, I often say they're not one monolith. You have a few brands who are still really strong in their commitment to recycled content and their sustainability goals, and who will likely exceed and make even stronger pledges for future recycled content. With that, though, you have many other brands who have made slow or even negative progress on PCR and are actively being seen as revising their goals and pushing them out, delaying them to 2035. For example, we have Keurig Dr. Pepper, who recently released their sustainability report, noting that they were not going to make the goal of 25% PCR by 2025, now has been transformed to a 25 to 30% goal by 2035. But at that same time, if you look at their historic data, they went from 18% recycled content in 2022 to 16% in 2024. So definitely not the trend that you want to see. We're seeing both sides of the spectrum. I think for the bulk of brands, though, their goals were still so far away from where they are today that there's a lot of ground to make up, even if they do revise the goals down and push them out some. So long term, you should still see ramp up plans in PCR content, but those ramp up plans are much slower than originally anticipated and also maybe are on pause, I would say, again now through end of year.
And you don't feel, and you feel this is more of a cost concern versus a tariff question of, hey, I have to source local product and it's not available. It's more of a, hey, the economy is weak and I need to protect my margins. Therefore, I'm going to use virgin product instead of the more expensive recycled product.
Personally, I view it more as the cost equation, especially considering the fact that under the present tariffs, as of this minute right now that I'm speaking to you, as we both know, they can change at any time. But virgin PET and rPET flake and rPET pellet, which are imported under the trade code 3907, 69, or 61, they're exempt from tariffs. So really, brands can't use the tariff card when they're talking about rPET. They could be using local or international supply. That's up to them. And there is plenty on a global scale for them to meet their goals. It just comes at a cost.
Um, I guess to close out this conversation, what should a brand or a recycler look at over the next 6 to 12 months in terms of planning with keeping cost in mind, keeping the weaker demand in mind, keeping the possibility of tariffs in mind? How would you go about it if you were in their shoes?
I think the first step is to set realistic expectations when it comes to a budgeting and procurement front. It is unrealistic to ever think that both virgin and recycled will be at price parity. Our pet, even if you had a 1 cent per pound bale on the East Coast, would still net a high 50s pellet price, which is competitive or maybe not even enough to beat imported virgin. So with that in mind, you have to be realistic in that this is going to cost the business and you need to justify, okay, this is why we're going to do that then. Maybe it's a regulatory clause. Maybe it really is an ambitious target of their leadership, but sticking to that very early on so that when the rubber meets the road midway through the year, like we're seeing now, and times may be tough, that there's good reason for you to stick to the original goals and plans that you had set. I also see the value in continuing to have conversations amongst buyers, suppliers of our pet about how the cost structure is set up. I think early on, this market really gravitated towards a bale formula for our pet resin prices, but that's not necessarily how most people are receiving their rPET these days. Some players go flake to pellet. Some players can go bale to pellet, but like I mentioned, they're buying flake on the side. And bale comes with a lot of volatility. As I mentioned, the inherent nature of the feedstock you're collecting from individuals like yourself, myself, that want their recycling picked up every Thursday. You can't turn that off just because there's a weak market signal. So there's inherent volatility in the bale. You're exposing yourself to that by having a bale formula. I've seen maybe some conversations around changing that pricing mechanism or looking at other hedging mechanisms or even a long-term contract if available.
Emily, any last thoughts on overall, if you zoom out in terms of everything that we've chatted about in terms of demand, supply, tariffs, policy changes that you would possibly want to list down as takeaways for our listeners?
All I can say that in my time here in this market, there has never been a normal year. And 2025 is certainly going to add to that. And I can guarantee you that 2026 will still not be normal. And so, really, in the face of this, we have to expect that there is going to be price volatility. So when you are forecasting for the future, give yourself a wide berth because more often than not, there could be international conflict that could influence ocean freight. There could be new trade barriers that could change your supply route. And there could be changing domestic capacities, which could limit availability. These are all true. So the better you can give yourself cushion for the future, you have a chance to appropriately react when the time comes. That, and I would just reiterate again, don't burn bridges during this time. It's very easy to want to seek cost savings for the business. But in the process, again, think of the long term implications of those decisions. Will the supply be there when you need it most in the future?
Emily, as always, thank you for your sharp insights. To our listeners, if this conversation sparked ideas or questions, please feel free to reach out so we can support you through these changes, not just with materials, but with the insight and the intelligence to move forward confidently. Emily, it's been a pleasure. You have now the good fortune of being on this podcast 2 times. So welcome back. And we always appreciate your insights. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Yes, would love to be on for a third. Thank you, Akram. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Emily. All right.